Have you ever just stopped and had that feeling, that creeping, slightly unsettling realization that, well, despite everything we think we know, all the facts, all the data, we're maybe fundamentally confused.
Oh, definitely.
About the really important stuff. I mean, not, where you left your keys, but the big things. Morals, politics, science, art, even just how should I live my life?
Yeah, the foundation.
You start tugging on one thread, maybe something like, what does justice really mean? And suddenly, boom, the whole thing just unravels.
It really does. And, that feeling, that's often the sign you're starting to think properly, to engage intellectually, recognizing that under the surface of our daily lives and sort of settled opinions, there's this profound muddle.
A muddle, yeah.
Most people just run on assumptions they've absorbed, right? But the second you ask why this assumption, the ground just vanishes underneath you.
So this deep dive today, it's really for anyone feeling that way, someone looking for maybe a shortcut through that muddle on these big fundamental questions.
Exactly. It's for that listener who feels the confusion and wants some clarity, some kind of map.
And the source material we're diving into gives us quite a starting point.
Yeah.
It frames this search for answers around a story, doesn't it? A young person seeking answers runs into, well, not your typical genie.
No, not at all. Forget the sparkles and the 3 wishes for riches. This genie is described as the tramp of the lamp. He specializes in fundamental confusion itself.
Okay, that's intriguing. So what happens?
Well, this narrative setup is clever because it immediately forces you, the listener, and the youth in the story to think critically. The genie, who's clearly more into mental gymnastics than, say, granting wishes for sports cars.
Right.
He offers the youth a choice. He says, 1, whatever you wish for, or 2, an unforgettable argument, guaranteed for a limited time only.
Okay, so wish fulfillment or an argument. I think most people go for the wish, right? The youth initially want something practical, like a bicycle.
Exactly. That's the common sense reaction. But the genie uses this moment to deliver the first unforgettable argument. He immediately throws a logical wrench into the works.
How so? What's the bombshell?
He points out the phrasing, I guarantee X or Y. He says, look, that doesn't actually guarantee you a choice between X and Y. Nor does it guarantee both are even possible. It only guarantees that at least one of those conditions, X or Y, will be met.
Oh, that's sneaky. It's deceptively simple. So if I guarantee I'll either, fly to the moon tomorrow or eat cereal for breakfast.
Right.
I fulfill the guarantee just by eating the cereal, even if the moon trip was impossible from the start.
Precisely. The logic holds, but the implication of choice or possibility we usually assume isn't actually there in the strict logic of or.
Wow. Okay, so that immediately sets the stage, doesn't it? It tells us we need to scrutinize everything, even basic assumptions about language. If or doesn't mean what we think, what about our deeper beliefs?
Exactly. It forces us to step back. What is this activity we call philosophy anyway? The source defines it as being about these deep thoughts.
Deep thoughts that serve 2 purposes.
Yeah. First, they're valuable just in themselves, gaining real insight into how things are, the nature of reality, knowledge. That's intrinsically rewarding.
And the second purpose?
It's a guide. Philosophy guides how we live individually and maybe even how humanity progresses collectively. It's fundamentally the activity of critically examining the assumptions that, well, most people just take for granted. Assumptions they might not even realize they have.
It's easy to forget that, isn't it? That all these subjects we study now, physics, biology, political science, they all started out as branches of philosophy.
They did. They branched off when they developed specific systematic methods for their questions. But philosophy doesn't just disappear once a science is born, because there are always fundamental assumptions left over. Think about physics. What is time? What is matter at its most basic level? Or ethics and science, what should we research? These aren't questions you can answer just by doing experiments. They're philosophical.
They remain at the root.
Always. That love of wisdom, philosophia, it's this ongoing process of digging at those core, unexamined beliefs.
Okay, so that brings us right into the first big philosophical battleground the genie throws us into. How do we actually know anything? Part 1, Epistemology, which the source calls the realm of conjecture.
Right. And we start with that definition most of us probably heard somewhere. Knowledge is justified true belief.
Seems reasonable enough. If you believe something, it's true, and you have good reasons for believing it.
And the genie, or rather the philosophical framework presented, immediately says, nope, that's logically broken. Why? Because knowledge, in the sense of being justified, supported, confirmed, verified, That's impossible.
Wait, impossible. That sounds incredibly strong. Why can't anything be justified? Aren't some beliefs better supported than others?
It comes down to what the source calls the rule of assumption. Think about it. Any argument you make, any explanation, any observation, any test you run, even basic logical steps, they all rest, fundamentally, on assumptions.
How do you mean?
Well, say you want to justify belief A. You offer evidence B. Okay, fine. But how do you justify B? You need reason C, and C needs D. You see the problem. You either go on forever in an infinite regress.
Or you eventually hit something you just have to assume is true to get started.
Exactly. You hit a foundational assumption, and because it's an assumption, it's not justified, it's just assumed. Therefore, everything we think we know, every theory, every belief, exists within this realm of assumption, or conjecture. Or, maybe less politely, guesses.
Okay, hold on. If I assume the sun will rise tomorrow because it has for, billions of years, isn't that a justified assumption? Isn't that way better than just randomly guessing the sun is, I don't know, a giant orange? Surely the evidence supports it.
But this is where we hit the crucial difference between support and refutation. This is a really key logical point. Let's use the classic example. The theory, all swans are white.
Okay. Before Europeans went to Australia, they'd only ever seen white swans, thousands of them. That must have felt pretty justified in believing that theory.
They probably felt psychologically certain, but logically, seeing 10,000 white swans or 10 million doesn't actually support the universal theory, all swans are white.
Why not? It seems like strong evidence.
Because the theory is infinite. It covers all swans, past, present, and future, everywhere. Your evidence, no matter how much you gather, is always finite. It's compatible with the theory, yes, but it can't logically confirm it. It's like reading the first chapter of a book and claiming it proves your guess about the ending is correct. It might fit, but it doesn't prove it.
Okay, I think I see that. Finite evidence can't prove an infinite claim. But then, what about finding a black swan?
Exactly. That's the power of refutation. One single solitary observation of a black swan can logically refute the universal theory. All swans are white instantly. Boom. Theory's dead.
So there's an asymmetry. You can't prove a theory true with evidence, but you can prove it false.
Precisely. Evidence is useful, incredibly useful, but only to criticize and potentially refute our theories.
Right.
Never to support or justify them. But the genie, or this philosophical line of thought, pushes even harder. It asks, okay, you saw a blackbird. How do you know it's a swan? How do you know it's black?
Because observing it also relies on theories, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Theories about what makes something a swan, theories about light and color, theories about how my eyes work.
You got it. Every observation is theory-laden. It implicitly contains bundles of universal theories about the world. So that black swan observation, it's also just a conjecture. It has to be tested itself.
So it's conjectures all the way down.
Pretty much. We're swimming in a sea of guesses. But, and this is the crucial step, we can still use those apparent observations, those conjectured counterexamples, to rigorously criticize our initial theories. We don't verify anything, but we can find flaws. We test, we criticize, we discard the failures.
Okay, but this sounds existentially terrifying. If everything's just a guess, why shouldn't I just act on the guess that I could fly off my roof? Or that gravity might just switch off tomorrow? This is the practical objection the youth raises, right? How do we live like this?
Right, it seems paralyzing. The answer given is critical preference. It's a methodological choice, not a claim about truth or justification.
Critical preference.
Meaning, we don't prefer the theory walking downstairs is safer than jumping off the roof because we've proven it true. We prefer it because that theory and the underlying theories about gravity and physiology have so far survived the most intense, rigorous testing and criticism we can throw at them. They haven't been refuted yet.
So we sort our guesses
into
piles.
Essentially, yes. Theories fall into roughly 3 groups. 1, those that have been falsified, refuted by evidence or argument. 2, those that have survived every test and criticism we've devised so far. And 3, those that are untested or untestable.
And we bet our lives, practically speaking, on the second pile.
We make a critical preference for the second pile. It's a preference based on methodological rigor, on survival, on what has worked so far, not on some guarantee of truth. And understanding this should actually make us less dogmatic. If our best theories are just unrefuted guesses, we should always be open to criticism, always ready to hear rival theories, even unpopular ones, because our current favorite might be wrong.
It's a big shift in perspective.
Yeah.
What about the really solid-seeming stuff, though, like math and logic, 2 + 2 = 4? That feels Certain. We had this feeling, this psychological certainty.
Absolutely, we have that feeling. But the genie is careful to distinguish that feeling of certainty from epistemological certainty, the idea of having an undeniably justified proven truth, which, according to this view, is impossible.
Even for math. But it's built on logic, on axioms.
Axioms are still assumptions. They're starting points we agree on, but they aren't justified from something deeper. And history shows us mathematical proofs that seemed solid for centuries were later found to contain subtle errors.
Okay, errors in complex proofs? Maybe. But 2 + 2 = 4. How does the genie tackle that gut feeling of absolute clarity?
He uses a clever, if fictional, magical demonstration in the story. He makes the youth momentarily forget the concept of the number 4 while counting his fingers.
What happens?
The youth counts 1, 2, 3, 5, 6. His internal logic is consistent within his altered conceptual scheme, but the fundamental concept of 4 has just vanished from his mind.
So the point is,
Yeah.
even for the clearest, most distinct ideas, the logical possibility of being fundamentally mistaken, or being deluded maybe by a malicious genie or just by some cognitive glitch, always exists, even if it seems incredibly unlikely in practice.
Exactly. That tiny sliver of doubt, the possibility of error, can never be logically eliminated. This kind of radical skepticism, the source notes, is often introduced late in philosophy courses.
Why is that?
For rhetorical effect, mostly. People usually take science seriously than maybe logic and math. If you chip away at certainty step by step, first showing science can't support theories, only refute them, then showing observations are theory-laden conjectures, and finally showing even math and logic aren't immune to the possibility of fundamental error, it builds a much stronger, if perhaps unsettling, case for the core idea. Everything is conjecture.
So what is knowledge then, if it's not justified true belief? If we operate day to day, assuming things are true.
This framework suggests much of what we rely on is actually unjustified, true unbelief.
Unjustified true unbelief. Break that down.
Okay. It's true in the sense that the conjecture happens to correspond to reality, like gravity keeping us grounded. It's unjustified because we can't logically prove it or support it, as we discussed. And it's unbelief in the sense that we don't, or shouldn't, hold it with absolute dogmatic certainty. We hold it critically, ready to discard it if it fails a test. It's the difference between correctly guessing the door is unlocked, a true conjecture, and having infallible proof it's unlocked, impossible. We live by making good guesses.
And the takeaway from all this epistemology, since it's all guesses anyway.
Be bold. Make big, general, highly testable conjectures. Go for deep explanations. Since justification is impossible, the only way forward is through daring guesses and relentless criticism.
All right, so if all our knowledge is just conjecture, the next obvious question is, what are we making conjectures about? What actually exists? This throws us into part 2, metaphysics, mapping the 4 worlds, you called it. The study of existence ontology.
That's right. The source we're exploring lays out a really interesting and comprehensive map. It tries to categorize every possible type of thing that could be said to exist, from a thought to a star. It divides reality into 4 fundamental realms or worlds.
Okay, let's sketch out this map. What's the first world? Something familiar, I hope.
Yes, world 1, matter. This is pretty much what we think of as the physical universe. Subatomic particles, energy, forces like gravity, light, and even empty space itself.
Why include empty space? Isn't that the absence of matter?
Well, in modern physics, space isn't just emptiness. It has properties. It's warped by matter and energy. It's part of the physical structure. So even though most of World 1 is technically empty, space itself is included here.
Got it. Physical stuff. What's next?
World 2, mind. This category covers all forms of consciousness. Your self-awareness, my self-awareness, but also potentially simpler forms of sensations of animals, maybe even more basic awareness if it exists. Anything subjective, anything that feels like something.
Okay, matter and mind. Worlds 1 and 2. Now, you mentioned abstract realms. This sounds trickier.
It is. The next one is World 0, modes. This is the realm of pure abstraction. Think numbers like the number 7. Think mathematical truths like 2 + 2 is 4. Logical patterns, philosophical theories themselves, perfect geometric forms like a perfect circle, and even impossible abstractions.
Impossible ones, like what?
Like the concept of a square circle. You can't make one in World 1, but the abstract idea of it exists in World 0 for us to think about and analyze.
And why World 0? That seems foundational.
Exactly. The numbering suggests it might be the most fundamental. The idea is that these abstract truths don't depend on matter or mind to be true. 2 + 2 = 4 long before any brains existed to think about it, and perhaps even before the physical universe of World 1 came into being.
Wow. Okay, so modes are pure abstractions. What was the 4th world?
World 3, memes. This is the bridge, in a way. Memes are defined here as modes, those abstractions from World 0 that have been recorded or instantiated in World 1 matter.
Give me an example.
Okay, the theory of relativity is an abstract concept, a mode in World 0. But Einstein's papers describing it, or a physics textbook explaining it, those are memes. The theory, mode, recorded in matter, ink and paper World 1. Computer programs, music scores, architectural blueprints, even the patterns of neural connections in our brains that represent ideas, those are all World 3 memes. They're how abstract ideas get a physical foothold.
Okay, World 0, 1, 2, 3, modes, matter, mind, memes. Let's go back to World 0, the modes. This sounds like the most philosophically debated one. Are these abstractions real or just labels we use? This is the old debate between realism and nominalism, right?
Exactly. Nominalism says number 7 is just a name, a useful fiction. Realism says the number 7, or the truth 2 plus 2, 4, has some kind of existence independent of us. The source argues strongly for realism.
What's the core argument for that?
It comes back to that independence. Was 2 plus 2 plus 4 true before humans existed? Before the Big Bang? If you say yes, then its truth doesn't depend on matter, World 1, or minds, World 2. It seems to exist in its own right in this abstract realm, World 0.
So when it says these modes have objective existence, it means they aren't just my personal opinion. I can't just decide that pi should be 3.15 tomorrow.
Precisely. We can invent theories about pi, some better than others, but the actual value of pi, the relationship it represents in geometry, that seems fixed. It's out there in World 0, waiting to be discovered or approximated. Anyone who thinks rigorously about these abstract objects, like mathematical theorems, should arrive at the same properties. They're objective in that sense. Their characteristics aren't up for subjective choice.
And the source claims this World 0 is infinite.
Yes. It contains not just the truths we've discovered, but all possible abstract truths and patterns. Every prime number higher than the ones we know, whether we ever find them or not. Every complex logical structure. And as we said, even the concepts of impossible things, like the square circle. The abstraction exists even if it can't be physically realized.
What's the point of realizing this world is objective and infinite? How does that help us?
It's incredibly freeing, intellectually. If there's an infinite realm of objective ideas and truths out there, it encourages us to be much bolder in our guessing, in our conjecturing. It suggests there are vastly more things to discover than are currently dreamt of in our philosophies. It pushes us to transcend our current limited theories.
Okay, we have this map of 4 worlds. Now let's look at the connections, specifically between World 1, matter, and World 2, mind. This gets us into part 3, philosophy of mind, consciousness, causation, free will, big topics. The source views mind as emerging from matter, but different enough to be its own category.
Yes, it's not strict dualism, but it recognizes consciousness as something remarkably distinct from just complex matter. And this immediately creates a huge problem for many materialist views, the problem of downward causation.
Downward causation, what's the issue there?
Well, if you think the brain is just physical stuff, neurons firing, chemicals reacting, all following the deterministic laws of physics, like incredibly complicated billiard balls, then where does conscious experience fit in? If the physical processes determine everything, what does consciousness do?
Right. If the physical stuff causes the mental stuff, but the mental stuff can't affect the physical stuff back, then consciousness is just along for the ride. It's often called an epiphenomenon, right?
Exactly. An epiphenomenon is something that's caused by a process but has no effect back on that process. The classic analogy is a rainbow caused by sun and rain, but the rainbow itself doesn't change the weather, or the steam from a steam train caused by the engine but doesn't power the train.
And if consciousness is just an epiphenomenon, that creates a massive evolutionary puzzle, doesn't it?
Huge. Consciousness, especially human self-awareness, seems incredibly complex and metabolically expensive for the brain to produce. If it does literally nothing useful for the organism, if it has no causal influence on behavior, on survival, on reproduction, how could it possibly have evolved through natural selection? Evolution favors traits that confer an advantage. An epiphenomenon confers no advantage. It just is.
So to solve this, the theory needs consciousness to have an effect back on the brain. It needs downward causation.
It absolutely does. The mind must be able to influence the matter it emerges from. The specific theory proposed here is fascinating. It suggests the conscious mind, World 2, grasps an abstraction, an idea, a theory, a plan, which is a meme, World 3, but apprehended by the mind. And by grasping that abstraction, it somehow pulls the physical brain, World 1, along with it.
Whoa. Pulls the brain along. How can something non-physical, like an idea grasped by the mind, interact with physical neurons without breaking the laws of physics. That sounds like magic.
This is where it gets highly speculative, admittedly. The source conjectures a possible link via quantum mechanics.
Quantum, oh boy.
Yeah, stay with me. Quantum mechanics famously involves probabilities and observer effects at the subatomic level. The conjecture, and it is just a conjecture, is that the conscious act of apprehending a meme might influence or determine the probabilistic outcomes of quantum events occurring within specific neurons in the brain. It wouldn't be violating physics, potentially, but using the inherent uncertainty within physics to exert influence. Mind selecting a possibility allowed by quantum laws.
So mind gives matter a nudge within the bounds of physical possibility.
That's the idea. If this could ever be tested, of course, it would move from philosophy into science. But for now, it's a philosophical conjecture to solve the problem of how mind could possibly matter.
And this idea of downward causation is also essential for salvaging free will, isn't it? Because there's that common argument against free will based on brain scans.
Right. The famous experiments, like Libet's, that seem to show brain activity initiating a decision, like lifting a finger, before the person reports consciously deciding to do it. Many people take this as proof that consciousness just registers decisions already made unconsciously by the brain. No free will.
But the source disagrees.
It argues this interpretation relies on a fundamental confusion. It conflates consciousness, the basic awareness involved in making the choice, with self-consciousness, the reflective awareness of having made that choice and being able to report it.
Okay, so the argument is the conscious, free choice does happen first, initiating the brain activity. But the process of becoming self-aware of that choice, enough to report it verbally or press a button about it, takes a fraction of a second longer.
Exactly. The brain scan picks up the start of the motor preparation after the initial conscious decision, but before the reflective self-awareness kicks in.
Why would there be a delay?
The conjecture here is evolutionary again. Action often needs to be fast. Maybe full reflective self-consciousness is just a bit too slow for immediate responses. So the initial conscious choice triggers the action pathway, and the self-conscious registration follows slightly behind. The decision itself, in that moment of initial consciousness, could still be genuinely free and undetermined by prior physical states, consistent with the downward causation idea.
So we can still be agents, not just puppets of our neurons.
That's the hope offered by this framework, yes. It preserves a space for genuine, conscious choice and responsibility.
Okay, we've grappled with knowledge being conjecture, mapped out reality into four worlds, and explored how mind might interact with matter. Now we need to tackle value judgments. Part 4, morality and aesthetics. How do we determine what's good or beautiful? With morality, we often get stuck in a dichotomy, right?
Yeah, the usual thinking is either moral claims are purely subjective, just personal preferences, like saying, I like chocolate ice cream, which doesn't oblige anyone else.
Or they're purely objective, like scientific facts. Lead is poisonous, which are true for everyone, everywhere, whether they like it or not.
And the source material says, well, morality doesn't quite fit neatly into either box. It rejects that simple binary.
So what's the alternative?
It introduces the concept of quasi-objectivity.
Quasi-objectivity, like sort of objective.
Kinda. Here's the idea. Moral statements aren't primarily descriptive, saying how things are, like science. They're mainly prescriptive, saying how things ought to be, what we should do. Murder is wrong isn't stating a fact, like water is H2O. It's stating a rule or a command.
Okay, they're prescriptions. But how does that make them quasi-objective? My preference for chocolate ice cream isn't quasi-objective.
True. The difference lies in how we treat moral claims in arguments and in our own convictions. When we debate moral issues, say, about justice or fairness, we use reason, evidence, analogies. We criticize opposing views for being inconsistent or having bad consequences. We act as if we're dealing with objective truths that can be discovered through argument.
I see. We don't just say, well, you feel torture's okay, I feel it's wrong, let's agree to disagree. We argue about it as if there's a right answer.
Exactly. And think about when you change your mind on a serious moral issue. You don't usually feel like your tastes just shifted, like switching from vanilla to chocolate. You typically feel you've corrected a serious mistake, an egregious error, as the source puts it. You feel you've discovered something closer to the truth about what's right.
That feeling of having been wrong, yeah.
That feeling, plus the way we argue, gives morality this quasi-objective status. It behaves like objective knowledge in our reasoning and convictions, even if it's fundamentally prescriptive ought rather than descriptive. Moral claims usually involve a claim to universality, too. If theft is wrong, it's wrong for everyone, not just for me. That universal demand adds to the objective feel.
Okay, that's a nuanced view of morality. Does this idea of value apply to aesthetics, to art as well? What makes something beautiful? Let's take a famous painting, say the Mona Lisa. Is the art the physical paint on canvas in the Louvre?
Common sense might say yes, but this framework argues, no, that physical object is just the world one matter. The real work of art isn't the paint, it's the image. It's the abstract pattern, the mode in World Zero that Leonardo da Vinci conceived and executed. The painting is just the meme, the recording of that abstract artistic vision.
The art is the abstraction, the image in the artist's mind at completion.
Essentially, yes. And this distinction is really useful because it helps us separate three things we often conflate when we talk about art.
What are the three?
First, there's the art itself, that abstract image or pattern, the mode. Second, there's the craft, the technical skill, the labor, the mastery of materials needed to create the physical object, the meme. Someone could be a brilliant craftsman but not create original art, or vice versa.
Okay, art, the abstract idea, and craft, the physical skill. What's the third?
Financial value. This is about the market price of the specific original physical object. It's often driven by factors completely separate from the art or the craft, things like rarity, historical significance, the fame of the artist. It's more like the value of owning Napoleon's hat than appreciating the hat's design. It's contingent, historical, commercial.
Right. So art, craft, and financial value are distinct. What's the implication of seeing the art as the abstract image?
It leads to a potentially controversial conclusion. Imagine the original Mona Lisa canvas has degraded over time, the colors have faded, there are cracks. Now imagine a technologically perfect, pristine, modern copy is made that accurately captures the colors and details exactly as Leonardo intended them, exactly matching the original abstract image, the art.
Okay.
According to this view, that perfect copy might actually be artistically more valuable than the decaying original, because it's a better, clearer representation of the true work of art, the abstract mode. You'd prefer to look at the perfect copy to appreciate the art, even though you'd obviously prefer to own the financially priceless, historically significant original.
Wow. That definitely challenges how we usually think about originals versus copies. The value lies in faithfulness to the abstract ideal. All right, we've covered knowledge, reality, mind, morality, and art. Now we brace ourselves for what the source material flags as the most contentious part. Part 5, political philosophy. And it starts with a pretty shocking claim. Politics is inherently immoral.
Yes, this is where the philosophical framework developed so far leads to its most radical, real-world conclusions. The argument, though, starts from a principle that sounds quite simple, almost common sense.
What's the starting principle?
It's this. Whatever is immoral for an individual person to do is also immoral for any group or organization of individuals to do, including the organization we call the state or government. Morality doesn't change just because you form a committee or put on a uniform. There's no special moral exemption for collective action.
Okay, that sounds plausible on the surface. So how does that lead to politics being immoral?
Well, think about what the state does routinely, fundamentally. It engages in actions that, if done by any private individual or group, would be universally condemned as immoral and illegal. Specifically, two things.
What are they?
First, aggressive interference with justly acquired property. That's primarily taxation taking people's earnings or property without their individual consent. Second, using aggressive coercion or the threat of it to force people to comply with its dictates, its laws and regulations, even if those people haven't harmed anyone else.
So the argument is, if I came to your house with a weapon and demanded a portion of your income to fund, say, a project I think is good for the community, that's theft and extortion.
Absolutely. You'd rightly call the police.
But if the state does essentially the same thing through the IRS or law enforcement, we call it governance, public service.
Exactly. The argument here is that changing the name and the agent doesn't change the fundamental moral nature of the act. Aggressive coercion and non-consensual taking of property remain immoral, whether done by a lone mugger or by a legislative body backed by police power.
Okay, that's a stark framing. But what about the standard justifications for state power? People usually argue we consent to government or that it's necessary for survival. How does this view handle those?
It tackles them head on. Let's start with consent. The claim is that genuine consent has to be individual, explicit, and ideally revocable. You have to personally agree.
But we vote, don't we? Doesn't majority rule imply consent?
Does it? If 51% vote to impose a tax or a rule, what about the 49% who voted against it or didn't vote at all? That rule is imposed on them entirely without their consent, often through the threat of force if they disobey. Majority rule isn't consent of the governed, it's the coercion of the minority, and often the majority too, on different issues, by the currently successful political faction. The source calls democracy, perhaps cynically, a popularly elected oligarchy, temporary power for a few over everyone.
So individual consent is lacking. What of the necessity argument? That we need the state for essential services, roads, schools, law, defense, welfare? Without it, wouldn't society collapse into chaos?
This is a powerful argument, psychologically. But the source argues it's largely false, often a self-serving myth promoted by the state itself. Historically, it points out, many of these services were provided voluntarily through markets, mutual aid societies, charities, private arbitration, community arrangements.
Really? Like private roads or courts?
Yes, and things like private charities handling welfare much more effectively, or voluntary associations providing education. The argument is that the state, using its coercive power, especially taxation, gradually crowds out these voluntary alternatives, makes them illegal or uncompetitive, until people forget they ever existed or could exist. Then the state seems necessary because it's destroyed the competition.
So the necessity claim is seen as an artifact of the state's own growth.
Largely, yes. It's not denying these services are important, but denying that the state is the only or the best or a moral way to provide them.
This connects to an economic critique as well, doesn't it? How state action differs from free market action.
Absolutely. In a free market, you have prices, profits, and losses. These act as vital signals, coordinating resources incredibly complexly. Prices tell you about relative scarcity. Profits attract resources to where consumers want them most. Losses tell producers to stop wasting resources on things people don't value enough to cover the costs.
It's a feedback system.
A massive, decentralized feedback system based on voluntary exchange. State actions, however, bypass this. Decisions about resource allocation, how much to spend on schools versus roads, which businesses to subsidize, who gets welfare, are made politically. They're based on lobbying, ideology, perceived needs, bureaucratic inertia, not on the price signals generated by actual consumer demand and resource scarcity. From an economic calculation standpoint, the source argues state allocation is inherently arbitrary and inefficient.
And what about the act of transferring wealth itself? Taxation, subsidies, welfare, taken from Peter to pay Paul. What are the economic consequences argued here?
Beyond the moral objection, the economic consequences are seen as deeply damaging. First, it obviously punishes productivity and incentivizes non-productivity, or worse, incentivizes lobbying for political favors rather than creating value. Second, it distorts those crucial price signals, making rational economic calculation much harder for everyone.
Okay.
But perhaps most importantly, according to this view, coerced wealth transfers attack capital accumulation.
Capital accumulation. That sounds important. Why is it the goose that lays the golden eggs, as the saying goes?
Because capital accumulation, saving resources from immediate consumption and investing them in tools, machines, factories, research, infrastructure that increases future production, is the fundamental engine of economic progress. It's what makes labor more productive.
And more productive labor means?
Higher real wages, more goods and services available at lower prices, a rising standard of living for everyone, including the poorest. Capital is what allows us to produce vastly more wealth than we could with bare hands. When the state taxes away wealth that could have been saved and invested, it consumes capital or diverts it to less productive uses. It essentially slows down or reverses the process that makes society richer and alleviates poverty organically. It kills the goose.
This is really digging into the foundations of political economy. It seems a lot hinges on how you even define liberty. The source distinguishes two very different concepts.
Yes, this is crucial. It argues much political confusion stems from using the same word, liberty or freedom, to mean two incompatible things. The first concept is zero-sum liberty.
Zero-sum, like in a game where one person's win is another's loss.
Exactly. This view sees liberty like that. If a thief steals your bicycle, the thief gains the liberty to ride the bike, while you lose that liberty. Any gain for one is a loss for another.
That seems problematic.
It creates huge philosophical problems. First, you can't maximize liberty for everyone if it's zero-sum. It becomes a scarce resource to be divided or fought over. Second, you end up in absurd situations trying to balance the liberty of the aggressor, the thief, against the liberty of the victim. Third, since liberty itself is defined as conflict or taking, you need some other external standard, like justice or rights, to decide which liberties are legitimate, meaning the concept of liberty itself isn't fundamental.
Okay, so zero-sum liberty seems like a dead end. What's the alternative presented?
Non-invasive liberty. This is defined simply and clearly. Liberty is the state of not being subject to coercion or proactive constraint initiated by others. It's about not having others invade your person or your justly acquired property.
How is this different?
Crucially, this kind of liberty can, in principle, be maximized for everyone simultaneously. My liberty, not being invaded, doesn't conflict with your liberty, not being invaded. We can all be fully free in this sense at the same time. It also clearly distinguishes liberty from license. The thief stealing the bike isn't exercising liberty, they're exercising license. Because their action is invasive, it proactively imposes on the victim's liberty.
So non-invasive liberty provides a clear, consistent principle.
Yes, one that resolves the paradoxes of the zero-sum view and provides a foundation for concepts like self-ownership and property rights. The course then outlines how this non-invasive principle can be philosophically derived and applied through a series of logical stages.
Briefly, what are those stages? It sounds complex.
It is, but the sketch is. Stage 1 is the abstract theory itself, the non-normative idea that proactive imposition is the thing to avoid. Stage 2 applies this factually, deriving self-ownership. You control your own body because you didn't proactively impose on anyone to get it, and ownership of resources you're the first to use or acquire through voluntary exchange.
Okay, self-ownership and property from non-invasion.
Stage 3 is institutionalizing these as rights. Stage 4 uses these rights to derive solutions to more complex problems like contracts, pollution. And Stage 5 defends the moral status of this whole framework, while crucially remembering the first lesson from the genie. The entire thing is still a grand conjecture built on assumptions, open to criticism and potential refutation, not a divinely revealed or justified truth.
Wow. Okay, so this deep dive has taken us through a really coherent, internally consistent philosophical system. From epistemology, everything is conjecture, through metaphysics, mind, morality, aesthetics, and ending with this very stark view of political philosophy. But it's also, as you said, profoundly heterodox.
Extremely. The source itself acknowledges that these conclusions, especially the non-justification of knowledge and the fundamental immorality of the state, are very much minority views within mainstream academic philosophy today.
Why is that, do you think? The source offers a critique of why philosophy might resist these ideas.
It suggests that philosophical progress often stalls when thinkers settle back into common sense, the prevailing assumptions of their time and culture, instead of relentlessly pushing the examination of those deep, often uncomfortable, foundational beliefs, like the genie demanded.
So, a failure of nerve, almost.
Perhaps. The source credits contemporary philosophy with high levels of analytical rigor, which is its strength. But it also criticizes what it sees as a weakness, a tendency towards suppressing or marginalizing genuinely heterodox viewpoints.
How so?
It points a finger partly at the structure of academia, the reliance on state funding and consensus-driven peer review in journals. It argues this system inevitably creates incentives to conform to prevailing orthodoxies and makes it harder for truly radical critiques, especially critiques of the state itself, to gain a hearing. Political correctness can also play a role in discouraging uncomfortable lines of inquiry.
Interesting institutional critique there. So let's bring it back to the story, the genie and the youth. The youth has heard all these unforgettable arguments. They've grasped the system. What happens with the choice? The bicycle or the arguments?
Having gone through this intellectual journey, the youth now understands the profound value of the insights gained. They return to the genie, and unlike their initial impulse, they choose the arguments. They recognize that understanding, wisdom, is worth more than the material wish.
The satisfying philosophical conclusion, but there's a twist, isn't there? A final secret.
A huge one. The genie reveals why he was imprisoned in the lamp 2,000 years ago. It wasn't for some grand cosmic crime. It was because of the youth's own ancestor, a woman named Sophia.
Sophia. As in wisdom.
The muse of wisdom, yes. The genie had neglected her love, causing her immense pain, and she left him. His punishment, perhaps self-imposed or cosmically imposed, was incarceration, knowing she lived and died without him. An eternity of regret.
It's incredibly poignant. So his turn to philosophy wasn't just intellectual curiosity.
It was his consolation, His philosophia, his love of wisdom, became his way to endure the unendurable loss of Sophia herself. It gave him something else to focus on, a stoical path through millennia of grief.
So the youth, having learned about morality, about the value of unselfishness alongside wisdom, now has one last wish or choice.
Yes, not for himself, not for a bike, or even another argument. He makes a truly unselfish choice, grounded in the moral understanding he's gained.
What does he wish for?
He wishes for the genie to be able to turn back time for himself, to go back to that moment 2,000 years ago and not neglect Sophia, to say the loving words, to keep her, to avoid the entire tragedy.
That's a beautiful moral act, but wait.
Exactly. Here comes the final crushing philosophical paradox. If the genie goes back, if he doesn't neglect Sophia,
He's never punished. He's never incarcerated in the lamp.
he never endures the suffering that turns him towards philosophy as consolation. He never becomes the philosophical genie specializing in fundamental confusion.
Which means the youth never meets him. The offer is never made. The unforgettable arguments are never given. The entire deep dive we just went through.
Poof. It ceases to exist. The knowledge gained, the choices made, all negated by the very moral action that the philosophical journey inspired.
So that leaves us, the listener, with a really profound question to chew on, doesn't it?
It does. Is that ultimate act of unselfishness, that supreme moral choice, worth it if it paradoxically erases the very philosophical understanding that made the choice seem right? Can a moral imperative ever justify obliterating the knowledge that grounds it?
Can philosophical gain ever outweigh a moral imperative, even if fulfilling the imperative undermines the philosophy itself? Wow, that's a lot to think about.